I'm here to complain about Johhny Harris's video on Netanyahu, which I hated. Potentially because he released a video on the same day as me. I just want to go through a few criticisms I have, largely to do with his framing. And I am going to skip over a lot of the history in the video just because I don't have time. But what I will say about his historical account in this video is that it's very neat. I want to focus on some of the more sensationalist, conspiratorial, misleading claims that are made in the video that I actually really hated. As a disclaimer, I am in support of a Palestinian state. I am a long-term advocate for Palestinian issues, and I'm a big hater of Netanyahu. Please don't leave yet though, please just give me a chance. The thing is, Netanyahu is such a bad guy, just as he is. It really annoys me when people exaggerate or distort details about him to kind of turn him into a Disney villain. He's bad enough. And the thing that annoyed me about Johhny's video is I'm not quite sure what he's trying to say. In this video, I'm just focusing on the claims that I find particularly offensive. Let's start with all the secret documents.
In 2007, the head of military intelligence for the Israeli army had a meeting with the US ambassador in Tel Aviv. We're looking at the classified cable that summarizes what was talked about in this meeting. In this leaked cable, you see that the Israeli official says that Israel would be happy if Hamas took over Gaza.
Ah yes, the leaked document that's been publicly available for 14 years. Very good investigative journalism. This is one of those instances that I feel is kind of sensationalized. For those of you unaware, this leaked document was leaked by Wikileaks in 2010 and it's been interrogated significantly since then. This document refers to a meeting that took place in 2007. Netanyahu wasn't Prime Minister in 2007, he was leader of the opposition. If Johhny Harris's thesis statement is that Netanyahu is trying to prop up Hamas and he's using this document as evidence, that doesn't make very much sense. At the same time, in the same batch of documents that were leaked to Wikileaks in 2010, there is a document that records a conversation Netanyahu had with an American congressman where he talks about how Washington could economically collapse Hamas and how it would be easier to weaken Hamas than it would be to strengthen Abbas. In that document, Netanyahu refers to Mahmoud Abbas as a nice man who means well, which I actually find far more interesting than the claims about Hamas. Why is a man who is so openly against the peace process, any land for peace deals, any Palestinian state, referring to the one legitimate Palestinian representative as a nice man who means well? Could it be because he's not threatened by Abbas at all? Could it be worth investigating how over the last 2 decades Mahmoud Abbas has ruined democratic principles in the occupied Palestinian territories, used the Palestinian police force against Palestinians as an extension of the Israeli state, done nothing to protect the lives or property of Palestinians living in the West Bank, and somehow managed to get very rich through this whole process? Now that's a video I'd watch. What I found very confusing is why Johhny would choose to black out the part of this document that explicitly says that this is not the general consensus opinion of the government of Israel. It seems like a strange decision to make if the document clearly says what you want it to say.
But there was another reason why Israel was happy that Hamas now controlled the Gaza Strip. The Palestinian government was now deeply divided, Hamas ruling Gaza and the West Bank being run by a more moderate, secular Palestinian faction. And crucially, neither considered the other to be legitimate, which weakened their ability to negotiate for any kind of state, for any kind of country, especially when Hamas still refused to recognize Israel's right to even exist. This division played right into the hands of the Israeli right.
This claim is of course nice for the narrative that Johhny is trying to push, but it makes absolutely no sense. Within a few months of these cables, the Annapolis conference happens where Ehud Olmert and Mahmoud Abbas try to come up with a roadmap for peace. Obviously it doesn't end up going anywhere, but Ehud Olmert is one of the few prime ministers of Israel that is willing for a Palestinian state to exist. In fact, he says at the Annapolis conference that without a two-state solution, Israel is headed for ruin. Either it's a situation where Palestinians can vote within Israel, or it's a situation that is akin to South Africa's apartheid state. A peace conference does happen very soon after Hamas takes over the Gaza Strip. While it is true to say that Hamas does not accept Israel's right to exist, since 2005, 2006, 2007, 2011, 2012, 2017, Hamas has confirmed that they would accept a state on the 1967 borders. Later in the video, Harris does discuss spoilers when it comes to the peace process. Minority groups that create a situation where peace becomes impossible.
But another theme of the story is that hardliners can use violence to derail peace. And that's exactly what happened here.
The footage he uses is of settlers and the right wing, but Hamas are equally responsible for spoiling the peace process. Maybe Israel would be happy for Hamas to take control of Gaza so that it could treat them as a hostile state, meaning that it could establish proper relations with the Fatah government in the West Bank and pursue peace. I'm not denying that divide and conquer isn't a strategy used by Netanyahu. It definitely is. I'm just confused about why this is the evidence to use to support it when it doesn't support the claim at all. Even with the two governments divided, Fatah and Hamas have had reconciliation talks pretty much every year. And for a long time, Hamas has implicitly agreed to the 1967 borders, which does make arguing for a state possible. Now, if you wanted to actually talk about divide and conquer, you would start with the policy document made for Netanyahu by American conservatives in 1996, the Clean Break document, where divide and conquer is exactly what these conservative think tank consultants propose Netanyahu do with the entire Middle East. If you want to talk about Hamas and Fatah, you might talk about after the talks in 2009, where Netanyahu said that Hamas could not be accepted as a negotiating partner. So if Fatah and Hamas were to reconcile, that would kill the peace talks. You might talk about 2011 following the Cairo agreement between Fatah and Hamas, where Netanyahu literally said the PA must choose between peace with Israel or peace with Hamas. There is no possibility for peace with both. You might talk about the fact that President Abbas has literally said he's been under pressure not to make a deal with Hamas. You might talk about the PLC council member who said that the EU, Israel, and the US all have a veto on peace with Hamas. Maybe you mention after the Doha agreement in 2011, where Netanyahu says that Abbas has abandoned peace with Israel to join with Hamas, or the sanctions that have been put on the Palestinian Authority anytime they've tried to reconcile with Hamas. All of that, in my opinion, is much stronger evidence of a divide and conquer strategy than a leaked document from a time when Netanyahu wasn't even in government that preceded peace talks by a few months.
We found this leaked video of Benjamin Netanyahu talking to some settlers in the West Bank.
The leaked video that's been available for almost a decade that was played on both Israeli and American television. That video?
He is admitting to sabotaging the peace accords that the Israeli government had signed with the Palestinians.
You can find multiple television interviews, media interviews, press conferences at the time when Netanyahu states this openly. Now, he doesn't say he sabotages the Oslo Accords, he doesn't say he stopped them, but he says that the Oslo Accords were not fair, it was a bad deal that would put Israelis' life at risk, and that he changed them, and he got Israel a better deal.
That because he disagreed with them, he wanted to sabotage them because he was so against a Palestinian state, or any form of Palestinian autonomy in this land.
Let's be very clear. Rabin's government agreed to the Oslo Accords. Netanyahu literally campaigned for prime minister in opposition to the Oslo Accords. Opposing the Oslo Accords was the center of his campaign.
Right-wing Israelis start holding rallies, calling their prime minister a traitor and a Nazi for giving land to the Palestinians. Some of these rallies are led by a now familiar character, Benjamin Netanyahu.
I'm a little confused as to why Johhny has made him look like an activist here. He is the leader of the opposition. This is literally his job. You have to understand that the Likud party platform has a claim to all of Eretz Israel, has in its platform that it will never negotiate with the Palestinians. He's representing his party's point of view. The only reason he continued with the Oslo Accords was to keep America on side. He did completely change the process. He made it work entirely in Israel's favor. Nothing he says in this video, he didn't proudly proclaim at the time because it was essential for him to stay in power. In fact, Netanyahu ends up losing power in this term because of the Y memorandum. It is seen as giving too much by his own party, the Likud. What is actually interesting about Netanyahu's interaction with the Oslo Accords is how he is able to get America to give him these massive concessions.
When he becomes the prime minister a couple decades later, he spends his term sabotaging the peace accords that his predecessor had worked so hard to create, claiming that the occupation of all this land and its people wasn't actually conquest, but rather the key for security of the Jewish people. They had to do this. Security was the one and only justification for all of this.
This is actually so close. How does he get America to help him do this? Because ostensibly, that's what makes it possible. The Christopher letter and the note for the record. Netanyahu is able to get a letter out of Warren Christopher, without which he will not sign any agreement, in which America supports Israel's right to designate military locations within the West Bank and to control the speed of withdrawal, and to connect that withdrawal to this concept of reciprocity. All of this massively changes the way the Oslo Accords play out. Essentially, it becomes up to Israel's goodwill when and if they withdraw from any area in the West Bank. I promise you, Netanyahu talks about this every chance he gets because Likud didn't want him doing anything with the Oslo Accord. And anyone who is interested in Netanyahu and the Oslo Accords, I made a video about it. It will be linked below.
And then he goes on to explain what his real thinking is on the situation. Netanyahu is a fantastic politician and statesman, and he's able to sort of cover up a lot of these policies in the name of security. But here we see what he really thinks as he's talking to these settlers, thinking he's not being recorded.
These are unfortunately Netanyahu's true and very public beliefs about terrorism. For some reason, he believes, despite no counterterrorism expert agreeing with him, that it is possible to militarily defeat ideological terrorism. That's just his gut on this one, something he's sticking by, said it a lot, written about it, not a secret.
Netanyahu is a key figure in this story because his worldview embodies a way of thinking that has taken root in Israel in recent years. The idea that the only way to give true security to the Jewish people is by doing whatever is necessary to stop the Palestinians from having a state anywhere in these borders.
This worldview completely predates Netanyahu. It was Herzl's worldview, it was Ben-Gurion's worldview, it was Jabotinsky's worldview, it was Weizmann's worldview, it was Menachem Begin's worldview, it was Yitzhak Shamir's worldview, it was Golda Meir's worldview. In fact, it was pretty much every historical leader of Israel's worldview, every major Zionist worldview. Overall, I think Ariel Sharon, Ehud Barak, Ehud Olmert, and Shimon Peres are the only Israeli leaders who have suggested that they are comfortable at all with the Palestinian state. Even Rabin, who Johhny seems to represent sympathetically in this video, was very much against a Palestinian state. And this is part of my problem with this video. If you represent Netanyahu as the whole problem, you miss the forest for the tree. There is no denying that Netanyahu is a bad, bad man who has completely got us to a place where peace is hard to even imagine, but he is not unique in his view of a Palestinian state. Yair Lapid, Naftali Bennett, Benny Gantz, none of these people support a Palestinian state.
And this is where we get to this paradoxical alignment, almost alliance, between Benjamin Netanyahu and Hamas, the enemy of Israel.
This is probably the part of the video that I hate the most, mainly because I don't like the conspiratorial undertone. Alliance is such a strong word to use, and it kind of reminds me of after October 7 when people were trying to suggest that the Israeli government knew more than they were letting on. I don't like this idea that Netanyahu and Hamas are in cahoots just because they might have a sort of symbiotic relationship or because ultimately their positions work well against one another. Of course, it works out for Hamas that Netanyahu has no interest in peace because a resistance group can't exist in peace. And of course, it works well for a man whose focus is national security to have an organization that fires rockets at them from literally their border, because then there's an omnipresent and constant threat. I don't like how that's framed. It leaves a really bad taste in my mouth. Especially how Johhny then evidences it with some rapid fire things that I'm going to go through now, but he just gives it a sentence and then moves on as if that's great evidence. So let's go through some of that now.
As long as Hamas held control over the Gaza Strip, the Palestinian cause would remain weak and divided. Netanyahu would feel justified in imposing this crippling blockade of the Gaza Strip, which in turn gave Hamas legitimacy among the people of the Gaza Strip, showing that their armed struggle against Israeli oppression was justified, provoking them to launch rockets into Israel to show that they were actually doing something, unlike the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, which in turn bolstered Netanyahu's narrative that the Palestinians actually don't want peace, they want violence and the destruction of Israel, and the only way for security is more occupation. So instead of try to take Hamas out, Netanyahu overtly supported them by approving huge transfers of untraceable cash, literally delivered in suitcases into the Gaza Strip, cash that would inevitably end up in the hands of Hamas to be used against Israel.
I really don't like it when something is dropped in a sentence and then just kind of moved on from, and I think the sort of mafia style suitcases of cash story is one of those things that sounds like extremely bad when it's not explained. That's not to say I support it, but I just think it's less bad when you you put it in context. In 2018, when this practice began, the Palestinian Authority had stopped putting any money into Gaza. So all of Gaza's civil servants were not being paid. There was no money going into Gaza. And a humanitarian crisis was really starting to happen. At the same time, there was a flare-up at the border. People didn't want to send money using the banks because Hamas was designated as a terrorist organization, which means that you could be taken to court for financing terrorism. Israel, not wanting to pay money to Hamas themselves, facilitated money coming from Qatar to go through to Gaza to do some humanitarian aid and to fund civil servants. Now, it is very possible because of this cash system that some of the money ended up with Hamas. In fact, most of it probably did, as Hamas was the government. The way that Johhny is presenting it is as if Netanyahu was deliberately funding Hamas to attack Israel. But this came from a false idea that Netanyahu had at the time that many people agreed with, that he could sort of bribe Hamas into peace or buy peace with Hamas. A lot of people, when talking about October 7, acknowledge that part of the reason for such a huge lapse of intelligence is there was a false buy-in to the idea that Gaza was doing economically well and there were work permits and money was going into Gaza and things were doing better for them financially, so there was no reason for Hamas to attack Israel. Things were going well, why would they jeopardize that? If anything, the cash suitcases was a miscalculation on Netanyahu's part, that he could bribe a resistance movement into giving him peace, more so than he was sending money in for Hamas to do terrorism against Israel. And once again, this wasn't a secret. Everyone knew about this. Everyone knew this was happening. So I just don't like the way it's kind of like, oh, look at what he did, Disney villain Netanyahu. It's like, this is a guy who's in a lot of trouble for bribery generally. Of course he's going to try and bribe Hamas.
He legitimized Hamas by negotiating with them, releasing 1,000 Palestinian prisoners in exchange for 1 Israeli.
This is a crazy thing for someone on the left to say. Like, it's pretty stock standard for someone on the right, but I assume Johhny is on the left. Imagine if someone said today, Netanyahu shouldn't negotiate with Hamas for a ceasefire or the release of hostages using a prisoner exchange, because that would be legitimizing Hamas. Negotiating with Hamas isn't legitimizing them. We normally negotiate with our enemies. So with the Gilad Shalit case, there's a lot of context, and I'll just try and speed run through as much of it as I can. Firstly, Gilad Shalit was abducted during his mandatory military service and was held hostage for 5 years and 4 months. He was abducted before Netanyahu was in power, and people tried to get him out that whole time. In Israel, there is a big culture of wanting their hostages back because everyone does mandatory military service. So when someone is taken hostage, that could be anyone's son or daughter, you know. At this point in time, Egypt was brokering the negotiations and the Arab Spring was happening, and it looked like the Muslim Brotherhood was about to come in. So the window of opportunity that Netanyahu had in order to get Gilad Shalit back was closing. Netanyahu did not set precedent. Hostage taking is a long-standing activity of Palestinian resistance groups, even in terms of asymmetrical prisoner exchanges. The Jibril Agreement, which happened under Shimon Peres, 3 hostages were exchanged for over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. And in fact, Netanyahu put a lot more conditions on his prisoner swap than Peres put on the Jibril Agreement. In the Jibril Agreement, lots of people were released who ended up being the leaders of the First Intifada. Netanyahu tried to be more conspicuous about who he let out. Obviously, he let out Yahya Sinwar, so he didn't do that good a job, but you know, it's the thought that counts. And also, Gilad Shalit's dad went hard in the paint for his son. Gilad Shalit was a dual citizen with France, so Gilad Shalit's dad went to France, he went to America, he went to the Catholic Church, he had people in the streets every weekend. It was intense. There was a lot of pressure to get this kid back. When the exchange was done, it was supported by 80% of the public, the leader of the opposition, the leader of the Labour Party, all of the religious leaders. This wasn't a secret deal. While there was some opposition, this was a widely supported decision by all of Israel to get this kid back.
And this gets us back to Benjamin Netanyahu, that enemy of the earlier peace talks. He gets elected once again in 2009, declaring himself Mr. Security and promising to provide safety to Israeli citizens who are still shaken from the Second Intifada and are now worried that Hamas now controls the entirety of the Gaza Strip.
The thing is, Netanyahu has presented himself as Mr. Security for his entire career. Prior to even being involved in politics, he really presented himself as a terrorism expert. He's written multiple books on counterterrorism. The idea of a perpetual existential threat exists outside of Hamas. This shouldn't be shocking to anyone, but the big fish for Netanyahu has always been Iran. Even if Hamas wasn't a threat, he has Hezbollah, he has the Assad regime, he has the Islamic Republic of Iran. So Mr. Security has plenty of threats lined up if Hamas were to disappear.
The more Netanyahu could keep Hamas in power in Gaza, but keep them contained, the more he could ensure that Palestinians remained divided. He could keep peace talks from ever happening, which in turn gave him time to continue to pursue his expansionist project in the West Bank.
It's so funny to me that Johhny uses an image of Yasser Arafat here because it kind of immediately demonstrates why his thesis statement is wrong. When we're looking at his first term as prime minister, when he's ruining the Oslo Accord or rerouting them, Hamas isn't even a major player yet. Yasser Arafat is still alive. He has massive problems with Yasser Arafat, but this is my exact point. If it weren't Hamas, it would be PIJ. If it weren't PIJ, it would be PFLP. If it weren't PFLP, it would be some other faction. That means that Israel can't negotiate with Palestine because Palestine are terrorists. Hamas just happen to be the people occupying that role right now. Netanyahu's been viewing Palestinians as terrorists so long as he's been interacting with Palestinians. And if Hamas were out of the picture, there would be some element of the Palestinian faction which he would find objectionable when it came to viewing them as a partner for peace.
A far-right Israeli lawmaker called Hamas an asset. So divide and conquer has been the name of the game in Israel for a long time, but especially in the last 16 years under Netanyahu.
You may or may not recognize this racist. This is Bezalel Smotrich, who is now Minister for Finance in Israel, but at the time of this statement in 2015 was entering or had just entered his first term in the Knesset and was a bit of a nobody. Listening to this statement and assigning it to the government would be like listening to Marjorie Taylor Greene and saying that she was representative of the US government, or listening to Pauline Hanson and saying that she represented the Australian government. Keep in mind, Smotrich also referred to human rights organizations as an existential threat to the state of Israel. This man is crazy. That's not to say it wouldn't be cool for you to talk about Smotrich, Johhny, because it really would. Why would Netanyahu form a coalition with a man that he spent years trying to distance himself from? You want to know a video I'd watch? One where you just dissect the coalition agreements that Netanyahu made in his last election. Actually, pretend I never said that. Please don't do that video because I'm doing that video. Instead of focusing on some strange conspiracy where Netanyahu is working behind the scenes on financially propping up Hamas, why don't you focus on the very obvious agreement Netanyahu has in place with far-right religious parties to keep himself in power, giving them concessions that put ordinary Israelis in danger? Why don't you talk about the fact that in the coalition agreement with the religious Zionist party, Smotrich's party, he literally says that Israel has a natural right to the West Bank and that the next term will be used to assert Israeli sovereignty over the West Bank?
Netanyahu's playbook was already made clear. He had said it point blank. It's what he had been doing for years.
So why did you spend 20 minutes trying to act like it was some big secret? This was fine, but I just don't like journalism that is bombastic or conspiratorial for views and in doing so distorts the truth. Because the truth is, Netanyahu's a terrible guy without suggesting that he funds Hamas. And unfortunately, Netanyahu is not the major problem when it comes to Israel-Palestine. Netanyahu will be out of power one day, and I don't want anyone being shocked when there's still no appetite for a two-state solution. At the end of the day, Johhny, you have 4 million subs. I have 500 and I don't know how to use After Effects, so stay unbothered. I hope you never watch this. Oh, also, I actually do spend a lot of time researching my videos, so if you are interested in what a bad guy Netanyahu is, I'm your girl. Please subscribe.